Here we have an interview on Democracy Now! Of reporter Peter Maass on what's going on in the Middle East. He wrote an opinion piece called "I'm Jewish and I've covered wars. I know war crimes when I see them." He makes a lot of uh, good points and speaks about how the Israeli government is committing war crimes.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We end today's show with journalist Peter Maass, who has written an opinion piece for the Washington Post headlined, "I'm Jewish and I've covered wars. I know war crimes when I see them," unquote.
I know there are going to be some people who's going to claim that he's a self-hating Jew because he's not in support of Israel. Shows the racism that still exists by claiming that Jewish people aren't Jewish just because they don't support what the Israeli government does.
Recently, Peter was a senior editor at The Intercept. He's the author of Love Thy Neighbor, A Story of War. He covered the Bosnia War for the Washington Post and the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq for the New York Times Magazine. Peter.
And we all know what happened with Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States eventually admitted that the invasion was a lie. There were no WMDs, and they murdered millions of people for no reason. That should have gotten the United States kicked out of the UN and considered a terrorist rogue nation, but it did not because the United States has an extreme amount of power and they will murder anybody that goes against them.
Peter, welcome to Democracy Now! You begin your piece in the Washington Post by saying, how does it feel to be a war crimes reporter whose family bankrolled a nation that's committing war crimes? I can tell you. Lay it out for us.
Well, my great-great-grandfather was Jacob Schiff, who was a financier at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, one of the wealthiest people in the country, probably. Who donated a lot of money and organized the movement of Jews, persecuted Jews from Europe, largely from Russia, but also from other countries in Russia, to any safe haven that would have them, including America, but also significantly British-controlled Palestine. And then his son-in-law, my great-grandfather.
He said British-controlled Palestine. So even he knows that Palestine existed even before the Israeli government, that Palestinians existed. So anybody who wants to claim that Palestine never existed or Palestinians don't exist, they're just liars.
Father Felix Warburg, who married Jacob Schiff's daughter, continued that process of supporting and helping to organize the migration of persecuted Jews from Europe to British-controlled Palestine. This is before World War II, the Holocaust, and the establishment of Israel.
Yet you say they were anti-Zionists. Can you explain?
Well, they were non-Zionists, which was actually different, significantly different from being anti-Zionist. There was a movement amongst American Jews and Jews elsewhere in Europe that was called non-Zionism. And for them, the non-Zionists, the point was Jews should be able to go to British-controlled Palestine. They need to go to British-controlled Palestine because they need refuge from the persecution they're suffering in Europe. But
why British-controlled Palestine? Why not anywhere else in the world that they could go to for refuge? The United States.
We're against the establishment of a Jewish state for two reasons. One is that they were concerned that if there were a Jewish state, then all the anti-Semites in America and elsewhere would look at Jews who are not living in this Jewish state and say, your loyalty is actually to this other country. And that would kind of increase suspicions of Jews and make them seem lesser citizens in the countries that they were living in. And then
which has happened with Jewish people that live anywhere else, like especially in the United States. Jews are considered to have like double loyalty, and a lot of anti-Semitic people claim that Jewish people have loyalty just to the Israeli government and see them as bad people for that. So they were the prediction of a Jewish state causing anti-Semites to become more anti-Semitic did actually happen.
The second concern, which is one that a lot of people had, but that non-Zionists also had and pronounced, was they were concerned about violence between Arabs and Jews. They just kind of said, look, if one side, the Jews or the Arabs for that matter, try to exert total control over the state that's going to be established there, because remember, at this time, Palestine was under the control of British mandate, then it's going to be really violent. My great-grandfather referred to it as a shooting gallery.
And Peter,
Well, yeah, Gaza and the West Bank has become a shooting gallery for the Israeli government. Um, you got the government genociding Palestinians in the West Bank, and you got the Israeli government arming and funding uh, Israeli terrorists to go kill people in the West Bank with the help of the IDF. If Palestinians decide to defend themselves, they will get killed by a tank blast.
you also covered the wars in Croatia and Bosnia, and could you talk about how your journalism there helps inform your perspective of what's going on? Because many of course, of our listeners and viewers are not familiar with those wars and the war crimes committed there.
In the early 1990s, Yugoslavia, which was a kind of conglomeration of different republics, 5 or 6, I forget the precise number actually, began to fall apart. And instead of falling apart peacefully, it fell apart violently. And there was first a war when Slovenia, one of the republics, seceded. And then there was an even larger war when Croatia, another one of its constituent republics, seceded. And then when Bosnia did the same, this was in 1992, this was unfortunately the largest war of all. There were a significant number of Serbs who lived in Bosnia. And Slobodan Milosevic, who was the leader in Belgrade of kind of all Serbs in the country, organized the kind of provisioning of military material and soldiers, guerrilla fighters, paramilitaries, to go in and basically fight against the Muslims and Croats in Bosnia who wanted to have an independent state and who voted in a referendum for an independent state. And the warfare, which I went to cover, it was not your ordinary war of army against army. It was a war of paramilitaries committing atrocities against defenseless civilians, largely.
Like the paramilitary of the Israeli civilians being armed and funded by the Israeli government to go into the West Bank and kill people.
Muslims, some Croats. And it also consisted of sieges against the few cities that were able to resist the onslaught. Sarajevo was one of these cities. Srebrenica was another one of these cities. And so I was there covering this war, seeing terrible things happen that are not supposed to happen in war. I mean, wars are violent. Civilians get killed in wars, but it's not always illegal. In this case, there were civilians right under my window in Sarajevo getting shot by snipers. I wrote about that. There were civilians whose houses.
Yeah, that's like the Israeli government sniping civilians that are occupied in churches, or civilians waving white flags, doing nothing, or civilians just standing around getting sniped by Israeli IDF.
Were getting bombed. There were civilians who were standing in bread lines who were getting bombed and killed. There were aid shipments of medicine and food that were being prohibited from entry into these so-called safe areas because they were supposed to have been protected by the United Nations, but were not.
Wow, just like the Israeli government bombing aid workers, the 7 that got airstruck by the Israeli government, the Breadline massacre, where the IDF shot down a bunch of Palestinians trying to get food from an aid convoy. I mean, wow, what happened here, the Israeli government is also doing.
And so I was there reporting on this. And in 1993, a year after this war began, there was an international criminal tribunal that was set up to investigate war crimes and possible genocide that was occurring at the time in Bosnia. And that tribunal subsequently did hold a number of trials, including of senior Bosnian Serb leaders, the military leader Ratko Mladic, the political leader Radovan Karadzic, and the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic, in which charges included genocide. And both Karadzic and Mladic are now in jail for the rest of their lives on charges that include genocide. So I was reporting on this genocide.
As you compare what you saw in Bosnia to what you saw in Gaza, you write in that piece, when I reported from besieged Sarajevo, I stayed in a hotel that was smack on the front line with Serbian snipers routinely firing at civilians walking under my window. On a spring day in 1993, I heard the familiar crack and whistle of a sniper's bullet, followed by an awful scream. I went to my window and saw a wounded civilian trying to crawl to safety. Writing in
Dude, imagine how traumatizing it is to be a reporter during a war, seeing all this, being unable to help these people, knowing that if you did try to help, you would be killed as well. Very traumatic. And what about the people that survive these crimes? Being, sniped by somebody, surviving, and then having to deal with that event for the rest of your life is very traumatic.
the Post more than 3 decades ago, I described the man's desperate shouts as a mad howl of a person pushed over the edge. It came from the lungs, from the heart, from the mind, you write in the Washington Post. You also write about disturbing video footage from Gaza that shows Hala Kres walking on a so-called safe route in January with her grandson, 5-year-old Taim Adel, who was holding a white flag when she was shot and killed by an Israeli sniper. Talk about the comparisons, or what you call the rhymes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's typical of the IDF to shoot people that are waving white flags. I mean, look at the 3 Israeli judges that were waving white flags, shouting in Hebrew for help, coming to the IDF, who got shot down by them because they were considered threats. Their own Israeli citizens were considered threats by the IDF. They were waving white flags, and the IDF still murdered them. It shows that the IDF doesn't care about their own citizens, nor does the Israeli government. And when it comes to Palestinians, they're even worse. They will murder anybody waving a white flag, which is illegal according to the international law. You are not allowed to shoot people that are surrendering. And that is what a white flag means, that they're surrendering, that they're unarmed, that they're not a threat. But the IDF will still kill these people.
I mean, God, I remember those stories so well. This is the most, there's so many disturbing things going on in Gaza now and in the West Bank. But as the Israeli attack began after the Hamas attack on October 7th against Israel, we began seeing these videos and reports emerging from these very brave journalists in Gaza of what was happening. And for example, that video of this grandmother being shot, obviously quite intentionally. And everything that I was seeing, flower line massacres in Gaza, for example, airdrops of humanitarian aid that killed some of the people they were intended to help because they landed on top of these people, also happened in Bosnia. I began seeing just the same kinds of incidents that were the constituent elements in Bosnia of genocide, also happening in Gaza, but kind of most disturbing in a way, at a scale that was larger than Bosnia. I mean, for example, in Bosnia, over the course of its 4-year war, there were something like 7,000 or 8,000 children killed, which is terrible. in Gaza, over the course of just 6 months, there have been more than 13,000 children killed. So,
And this is allowed because the United States continually protects the Israeli government no matter what they do and defends them. So even if they kill a bunch of kids, the United States defends the Israeli government and they're allowed to continue to do what they do. I mean, look at, again, Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States invaded because they claimed that the leader was mass murdering people. But when it comes to the Israeli government mass murdering innocent people, the only thing that the United States does is defend their actions and act like they're the good guys.
I just could not help but see not only the parallels, but also how what seems to be unfolding in Gaza is even worse than what I saw in Bosnia.
And we have less than a minute left, but I'm wondering your perspective on how the U.S. media has been covering the war in Gaza.
It's been a real mixed bag, and it was a real mixed bag in Bosnia. You know, and we're all kind of captives of our experiences. And so I covered the war in Bosnia. And I also covered other wars. So, I may be talking too much about Bosnia, but I think it is relevant. In Bosnia, there was exceptionally good coverage, I think, and I'm biased on this, but I think from the journalists who were on the ground, largely foreign journalists, but also a lot of Bosnian journalists. Really good coverage of actually what was going on. But then in the foreign capitals, in Washington, D.C., but also London and France, and Britain were very important elements of the international community at the time. The reporting was terrible because it reflected the kind of briefings that the journalists were getting from all their government sources and all the think tank people, and they were just saying, oh, it's a mess.
We have 15 seconds,
Kill
Peter.
each other. So we have the same problem now where there's a lot of bad coverage coming out of the capitals, such as Washington, although from the